You just mentioned sound ports, which is a hole in the side of the guitar, um, and that's something I find quite interesting because you're increasing your essentially increasing the effective area of your sound hole by putting another hole in there, which is going to increase your resonant frequency. But the sound port has another effect, which is more of I guess it's sort of like a psychoacoustic effect. It changes the way the sound is being projected from the guitar.
Yeah, and I was a sort of for a while I was a firm non-believer in the sound port, in that I didn't think that it really offered the player that much. The idea behind them is that I think that the origin and idea behind the sound port was the idea that sound is sort of radiated out of the sound hole, and the sound hole is much more of an air hole, like we've just discussed, and not actually that much sound is actually radiated out of it. There are certain frequencies that are, but more sound is radiated off the sound board. And the sound hole, but the general idea of the acoustic guitar is that the sound comes out of the sound hole, because why wouldn't it? And so they thought, let's drill a hole in the side to give a sound hole to the player. And sort of I was always so skeptical of that whole idea. But then the first time I ever used one was when I designed a new model of my guitar, and I'd sort of missed the mark on the frequencies that I was chasing, and I was too low in my air resonance, and so I thought, well, may as well drill a hole in the side of this guitar, and added a sound port, and that was sort of the first experiment into the world of sound ports. And I was surprised at actually how much of a difference it actually does give the player. It actually does give a portion of feedback to the player, and it almost does sound like the sound that you would hear when you're sitting in front of the instrument. You are getting a little bit of that when you're sitting sort of behind the instrument. And I did tests where I would have a player playing and I would have it taped closed, and then as they were playing, I would open it up and see if they could hear a difference. And I had some people who were extremely skeptical, who were total sound port naysayers, and even them in this experiment, doing it on a very lively, responsive instrument. That particular instrument was one of my favorite sounding guitars I've made, actually. They would say that it made a clear difference in what the player was hearing, which was very interesting.
Yeah, but I also find when you stand in front of a guitar listening, and it's got a sound port, there's just something different about the way the sound fills the room or radiates from the guitar.
Yeah.
And generally it's quite appealing. So do you then have you started incorporating sound ports sort of as a standard, or is it still just something you keep in your back pocket for emergencies?
Just a tool in my back pocket.
Yeah.
unless of course a client says
Request.
I want a sound port.
So you didn't like the effect it had so much that you would consider, say, making a guitar with an unusually small sound hole and then adding the sound port to get your air frequency in the desired place, while then also having that sort of sound.
So that's where sort of the again you've got the mass and stiffness coming into play, because on this particular instrument I had already gone too low with my air resonance in particular, and my air and my top were too low, and I wanted to raise particularly my air but also the top. So essentially, the top was too mobile and too floppy. So it wasn't stiff enough, but because I was adding the sound port to raise the resonant frequencies, I was maintaining the same sort of stiffness and mass in the top itself. And I think that was one of the contributing factors as to why that instrument sounded so great, is because I had gone lower and then raised it back up with the amount of air able to travel in and out of the instrument. And so essentially the top was more active. And I think that was one of the contributing factors. And so in that case, leaving my sound hole the same diameter for whatever model I am making, and adding a sound port into my sort of design, and then not using it as much as a tuning tool, I guess that I could sort of recreate that sound that I really appreciated.
Right. And then I was just thinking, because then you still have the Tornavoz tool, but that's only for lowering, so you wouldn't then have unless you go and ream your sound hole.
A Tornavoz could also be used in raising if you have one in.
And right,
and you could essentially make it smaller.
Right. There's an idea.
Yeah, so you could put it in and then just shave it, or make it completely removable. I think Trevor Gore has made a completely removable Tornavoz. So you could essentially, and he's also done this. You could make one guitar essentially be two guitars suited for different styles of music or different tunings, because at what frequencies your modes are vibrating at determines the voice of the guitar, and that in there determines sort of what styles of music or what tuning that guitar may be best suited for. And so by including these sort of tuning methods, these sort of predominantly final tuning methods of adding mass to the sides and increasing or lowering the amount of air able to flow in and out of the instrument, you could make one guitar be suited to sort of two different tunings. I mean, you could even do that with like you know how, I mean, I'm sure you've seen how some sound ports have that little sliding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's about to mention that.
You could have it open and suited for a higher set range of frequencies, and then closed for lower range of frequencies. But what I've noticed from what other builders have done is that when they've added those sliding sound port covers, generally the player always keeps it open no matter what.
Right. Yeah, because it's for the player, it's that the effect of the sound port rather than what it's doing to the frequencies. It's that the feeling of the sound coming up at you.
Yeah,
that's appealing.
Exactly.
And so the idea I have I'm not doing sound ports, but I want to start doing them. And my idea is to have put a Tornavoz on the sound port, like a pretty long tube, so that in terms of what it's doing to the frequencies, it's not really doing anything because you're raising and lowering it by the same amount. And then you have the option of shortening that tube to tune it. And then you always have that effect.
That would be really interesting to see what effect the Tornavoz on a sound port would have on the effect of feedback to the player.
Oh yeah, that too. Yeah. I was just more thinking of just controlling the frequencies, but it probably changed so much else as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you get into sort of what the sound port, how it's coupling with the air inside the instrument, it gets very complicated.
Yeah.
And I don't fully understand, like, to the exactly what's happening and how the air is moving, because I know that the air resonance and the way the two pistons of air that are working from the sound hole and under the soundboard, in between the back and the soundboard, and how the air inside is to visualize it, it's sloshing between the two pistons like water in a bathtub. Then when you add a hole that's irrespective of those two air pistons, I don't fully understand how that hole is coupling with that air.
Right. Yeah. The other thing to remember about the air is that just like everything else, it has multiple modes of vibration, and we're focusing on tuning its fundamental.
Yeah.
But there are higher order air modes which are also getting excited, and
lower ones, which I found my
oh
instrument.
really?
Yeah, which is crazy, because generally you would expect that the air is the lowest mode of vibration in cavity resonance, but on these instruments with these sides,
look at that.
I've gotten I've picked up modes vibrating at like around 60 hertz, 65 hertz.
And what is that? How does that manifest? If you look at the cladding patterns, what do you see?
Well, that's how I'm finding it with the cladding patterns.
And does it look like a monopole on your top,
it's a monopole mode. Sometimes I get a dipole that's below the air resonance, which is crazy. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I have to think about that one. But I wanted to link that to the sound port thing. If you're thinking about the modes of the air modes in the box, it's in all directions. So you have between your top and back plate sort of waves moving up and down. You've got ones going side to side.
Yeah, of course, because it's expanding and contracting. So
yeah, in all directions. So it's going in all directions, but you have you have essentially cross grain air modes and long grain air modes. And if you think of it as a sine wave, because they're standing waves, so looking particularly along the length of the box, right?
Mm-hmm.
If a standing wave forms at a certain frequency, that means that at the peak where the air is moving most, your antinode of that air mode is in a specific place, right? So it's in a specific spot in terms of the distance, say, from your tail block or your head block. So if you can place your sound port so that its position on the sides corresponds with where that peak is, then you're going to allow that specific peak and that specific mode to have probably a more noticeable or maybe a more significant effect on the overall sound of the guitar. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Just like placing the modes in between, placing the mode frequencies in between the scale notes on the fretboard, placing the sound port in between the node lines of the vibration of air.
Right. Yeah. And then I imagine that would have like some sort of a more noticeable effect for the player from the sound port. So
could you theoretically work out where the node lines of the air movement inside the guitar are, or would it be more down to a trial and error sort of thing?
It's probably possible theoretically, but I think it'll be influenced a lot by the specific shape
Yeah.
of your box.
Yeah.
I remember reading, it may have even been Graham Caldersmith who did this, but he or someone put a mic on a stick through. They started with like a rectangular box, and then they put the mic with the stick like in there, pushed it, and found the spot where the air mode was, where basically finding the nodes and antinodes of the air mode.
Yeah.
And so I think you could probably do the same thing, and then for each of your models find the optimum place. Yeah. So then you have. So that's the other thing with sound ports. It's first of all the fact that there is a hole is affecting your resonant frequencies. It's affecting the player's experience, the way they hear the sound, and then also I think the exact spot where you put it could also have a pretty big effect if you place it in the right place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd never really thought of the placement playing that large a role, and so
Well, I
maybe
don't know if it's a large role.
maybe on that guitar, the potentially playing that large role.
Yeah.
Maybe on that guitar, it was just in the sweet spot and it just worked
Yeah.
so well.